G'day everyone. Welcome to this week's episode of NRL Offside. Another round of games in the books, JC. Plenty of absorbing football to discuss. How was your week, mate?
Hello, Noz. Hello, listeners. It's great to be back for episode 4. Mate, not sure how your tipping went over the weekend, Noz, but geez, I had an absolute shocker. A few teams surprisingly hit the reset button over the weekend, namely the Broncos and Dolphins, while some others who were expected to show up, well, just bloody well didn't. And I'm looking here at you, the Roosters and Sharks. So I look forward to your punchy takes in the speed round, Noz, and of course, our new dance jingle intro. So can't wait for that, mate.
Mate, the dance jingle was a big hit last week, particularly with my 9-year-old daughter. But in terms of tipping, it seems as though the stranger the results, the better my tipping goes. So I'm not going too bad at the moment. I've got my fingers crossed that all of these odd results that we're seeing continue, because that usually bodes pretty well for me on the tipping table. But before we go on, Johnny, last Saturday we had some terrible, terrible news, and that was with the supposed passing of Chuck Norris. Now, made a little bit like moonwalking, those kung fu shoes. Remember the kung fu shoes, Johnny? The black ones with the little red rubber soles, and Parramatta actually winning competitions. Chuck was an indelible part of our childhood in the 80s. We all spent hours watching classic VCRs like Lone Wolf McQuaid, Way of the Dragon, Delta Force. That is, if we could actually find them amongst the 35,000 rental tapes at home, Pics in Maroubra. I know we truck in a lot of nostalgia in this show, but the passing of Chuck feels like a little part of all of us has just died. So, Vale Chuck, like the current Eels Premiership drought, let's just hope that it is a long blink.
Home Pics Maroubra, Noz. Mate, I'm laughing out loud, mate. That were great memories of the 80s. And yes, Vale Chuck Norris.
Now, Jesse, it's time. Mate, we made such positive strides last week with our speed round. Now, this is just a reminder, mainly to ourselves, that it is a quick fire recap. Let me just point out the operative word there, quick fire recap of the previous weekend's games. Now, mate, if you go settle into the starting blocks, I'm going to cue up the jingle. As soon as that jingle finishes, Johnny, mate, you are a go. So, listeners, get ready.
Right, mate, let's kick off with Raiders versus Bulldogs. Very tough, wet conditions down in the capital, where we saw the classic Dogs just grind down the opposition. The Green Machine, on the other hand, they really hurt themselves just through poor discipline and consistently just handing over field position. A big shout out to Connor Tracy. I thought he was outstanding. And that last-ditch tackle on the Raiders, number 7 at the end, was an absolute beauty. Let's move to my Roosters versus the Panthers. Surprisingly, the Roosters actually came out flying and dominated the first 15 minutes. Toy could have had a double early, but then it's the same old story. The Penrith machine just clicked into gear, and as you know, once they do that, it's pretty much shut the curtains. I thought Robbo's assessment of the Roosters in the post-match was pretty spot on, where he borrowed a line from Mike Tyson where he said, everyone can fight until they get punched in the face. Well, the Roosters pretty much got punched in the face from about minute 16 to 80 and really didn't fight back. Extremely disappointing. And now Penrith have actually beaten the Roosters 12 times in their last 13 matches. Let's move to the grand final rematch. Broncos versus the Storm. Mate, the Broncos are making a habit of comebacks, as we saw late last season. This grand final rematch was another game of two halves. The Storm controlled the first and looked comfortable, and then Brisbane pretty much flipped the script in the second half. The Broncos came out with high energy and attack, scoring 18 unanswered points. This was a huge turnaround, especially with all the noise leading into the game around Madge, Brisbane's slow start to the season, Adam Reynolds, Gordy's comments, and his unbelievable showdown with Dita Badel. Well done, Bronx. Moving to the Knights versus the Warriors. It was always going to be a tough ask for the Knights with their big-name players out. But regardless, you can't compete with poor discipline, especially against this Warriors side. Warriors are now 3 from 3 to start the season, and importantly, they've notched their first win on the road. They're looking pretty good, again led strongly by Jackson Ford and Tanner Boyd. These two must be right up there on the Dally M ladder after three rounds. So well done there, guys.
Okay, on to the Sharks Dolphins. The Sharks took their newly minted name of the stadium, Ocean Protect, to its logical conclusion by not actually tackling anyone wearing a Dolphins jersey on Saturday night. In saying that, though, the Finns were dynamic, showing yet again that a team who can put points on the board is always going to be dangerous. And a message to Fitzy, maybe you should do less bristling at press conferences when you get hard questions and more bristling at the boys in the dressing sheds at halftime when they're not actually tackling anyone. Rabbitohs Tigers. Well, in our preview of this game, we said that it was likely to be a lively encounter. The only thing that was lively about this encounter was the crowd, who created a great carnival atmosphere up in Gosford. In fact, there are entire swathes of the game where it was better to watch the people in the crowd than it was to watch the game. The Tigers seemed to play for the sum total of 4 minutes in the lead up to the half-time break, while the Rabbitohs, with the honourable exception of Jack Whiten, who really must be regretting his move from Canberra at this point, sleptwalked their way to victory over a Wests team that just can't seem to break its bad habits. Benji ball? It just seems to be more of the same for the Tigers. Occasional bursts of creativity courtesy of Coruscant or Luai, but mostly unstructured try. Eels Dragons. If the Rabbitohs Tigers game disappointed, this game certainly didn't. It had all of the creativity that we had expected from the game in Gosford. The Dragons came out of the gates early with strong showings from Sully and Luai. That's a stunning coincidence that only comes around about as frequently as Haley's Comet, but it didn't last for the Saints. Parramatta were lucky, particularly with that last try to the Fox, but ultimately they got the win in a game that was fun, if not necessarily high quality. Cowboys Titans. Well, I suppose somebody had to win this game. It wouldn't have thrilled the purists, but at least it saved us from the sight of Toddy Payton jumping out of the coach's box for another week. Scott Drinkwater, he is a class act Scott, and he showed that tales of his demise are premature. While the Titans, let's give some credit where credit's due, they managed to stop grinding the gears and get into some semblance of forward motion. The boys are off their duck. The Titans are still waiting, but a little bit more on that later. Well, there we go, Johnny. Speed round wasn't too bad. I think we did it in about 3.5 minutes. Maybe we could describe it as speed-ish round. But, mate, keeping the roll going, what caught your eye this week?
I'm loving the Thomas Jenkins story at the moment. I also love his great nickname too, Milky. They're calling it his second life at Penrith. The guy came through as a junior at the foot of the mountains, didn't quite crack it early. He then headed to Newcastle for an opportunity, plays about 5 games, gets dropped, and then eventually gets released. Last year, he returned back to Penrith, where he was playing in the Ron Massey Cup, I think for St Mary's, which is basically reserve grade. Fast forward to today, he's now played over 20 NRL games for the Panthers since returning back, which is an amazing effort. And if you look at it on form, he's actually now locked down a centre spot, keeping out a quality player like Isaac Targo. And then on the weekend against my Roosters, who, as you know, didn't show up, he bags 4 tries. I think it's an unreal story, and I'll put it out there. Could Milky be a smoky for Origin, Oz?
He wouldn't disgrace himself in a Blues jersey. Now, mate, I don't want to fact check you in real time here, but you mentioned that Jenkins played his junior football at Penrith. He was actually born in Boorowa in southwestern New South Wales, and he played his junior footy at the Young Cherry Pickers. Now, mate, I love the name of the Young Cherry Pickers, along with the Park Spacemen, the Casino Cougars. Just like to give a shout out to my great mate Johnny Croak at this point, and the Maitland Pumpkin Pickers. It's one of the great names in our sport. I also have just a couple of thoughts related to that. Firstly, the incredible contribution that bush footy has made to rugby league and continues to make to our sport. Every year when the Origin players come on and mention their junior clubs, it's remarkable how many players from both New South Wales and Queensland are from teams outside of the major cities. Even if you just look at Penrith, we've got Isaiah Yeo from Dubbo, Liam Martin comes from Temora, Dylan Edwards comes from Dorrigo. So, mate, there's a lot of players who are still holding out that great tradition of bush footy, and Jenkins is the latest in that storied lineage. Mate, the second thing is player maturity. Now, in this day and age where sport is such a big business, player recruitment just seems to be going back further and further. They're now looking at 11 and 12-year-olds as the next big thing. It's ridiculous. It's damaging to both the sport and particularly the kids. It's always great to see a quality older player given the opportunity to come up into first grade, to develop a little bit and thrive. In the last 10 or so years, we've seen it with Cody Walker. We've seen it with Billy Walters. They've made their debut a little bit later in life, and they've subsequently made a big impression. Jenkins is a great example of that. So, mate, well done to Ivan Cleary, well done to the Panthers, and well done to Jenkins himself. And finally, just in terms of his skills, I mean, you mentioned a little bit of this when you talked about his 4-try haul against your Chooks, but mate, he's really good on his feet. He has that talent, which is really important with wingers in terms of being in the right place at the right time. And he's a fantastic aerialist. He's a real weapon whenever they put the ball up. Now, in terms of that, the only thing I'm hoping, Johnny, is that he doesn't replicate his 4-try haul against the Eels this weekend. But considering our defence across the three-quarter line, mate, it is a possibility. So we'll see how we go with that. All right, Johnny, onto the grapple. So for those people for whom this is their first time listening, the grapple is our section where we wrestle over some of the game's hot topics. This week, we're going to be talking about Brisbane, what they mean to the competition, their current status. So, mate, what are your thoughts about the Broncos? Not so much their 2026 iteration, but the club in general.
Look, the Broncos, we all know they're a different beast. They're a powerhouse club. I've always said this, even with the three other Queensland teams in the competition, in my opinion, they still carry the state, and obviously that brings serious expectations. This isn't a club that's judged on effort. It's premierships or pretty much nothing. They had the hugely successful Bennett era, as we all know. He set such a high bar that pretty much everybody afterwards has sort of struggled when they've come along. Then Madge comes to the club last year and wins a comp in his first season, and he's still under pressure. That sort of tells you a lot about the Broncos. They have a reputation for being the sort of glamour boys, headed by our man Reece Walsh, and they seem to always be in the headlines with the media, both north and south, loving a Broncos story. So for me, it doesn't matter which way you look at the Broncos. It just seems that the spotlight never seems to leave them. It doesn't matter if they're winning, losing, or having a draw. So that's pretty much the story of the Broncos, in my view.
Even in Sydney, we have 8 clubs of our own. We've got all of our own distinct tribal loyalties. Mate, the Broncos have always commanded a fair bit of bandwidth, and that's really come to the fore over the last couple of weeks with all the stuff about Adam Reynolds and Gordon Tallis. And, mate, it is no wonder. This is a team that's been incredibly successful. They've been in the competition now for just on 40 years. Over that time, they've won 7 premierships. They've done it with flash, but they've also done it with toughness. Brisbane's the club of Alfie, Kevy Walters, Darren Lockyer, but it's also given us Shane Webke, Gordon Tallis, and Petro Sivanasuba. Now, onto the current mob. Mate, over the last 6 or 7 years, they've actually been the absolute epitome of inconsistency. They've fluctuated from wooden spoons to almost winning the comp to missing the semis. And it's all been done on a background of a constant churn of schoolgirl level drama. Now, to address this problem, they brought in Madge in 2025. I thought Madge did a fantastic job. He cut out all of the nonsense. He made all of their elite talent really knuckle down. And what was the result, Johnny?
They won the comp, mate.
They won the comp, yeah. The first week in October, they hoisted the Proven Summons trophy. So whatever it was, it seemed to work. But this year, they just seem to be back to their bad habits. All we seem to hear out of Red Hill is whinging. And a lot of that whinging seems to come from the players. I mean, Madge's training is too hard. What about our family time? Oh, geez, why did they shaft poor old Kevy? He was a great bloke. And, mate, in a lot of ways, the start of their season has actually reflected that inconsistency. Their first round, they just didn't get out of the starting gate against the Panthers. Their second round against Parramatta was, frankly speaking, pathetic. And then suddenly, we're all expecting them to get into Melbourne last Friday night and cop an absolute shellacking. And they completely turned it around and showed that they're still very much a premiership threat. Now, despite the rosy glow from last weekend's win over the Storm, I just think this shows a club that struggles with attitude. And we can talk about Madge all that we want. This is a team that's desperately in need of on-field leaders. That leadership at the Broncos, it needs to come from the best players. Now, Reece Walsh might ponce around with his black nail polish and be putting up social media posts drinking from the toilet, but I don't mind any of that. That's what people do in 2026. But that has to be balanced with leading from the front. The same with Payne Haas. I mean, Payne Haas has supreme athleticism and supreme talent, but he needs to channel that into week in, week out inspiration. So enough behind the scenes bitching, boys. Yeah, Badger's going to train you hard. Don't go off whinging to Gordon Tallis so he's got fodder for another weekly anti-Broncos round on NRL 360. Just get out there and show it on the field. Now, mate, my final thought with this one is about playing in the NRL. Now, as with any professional sport, playing in the NRL is not, I repeat, it is not a normal profession. Mate, you're competing every single week at the highest level. You're playing against absolute killers week in, week out. And that comes with all of the benefits and burdens. I mean, come on, Broncos, Madge may push you hard. You might need to attend one of his ridiculous preseason camps where he wakes you up at 3 a.m. in the morning with a cold hose and has you howling at the moon. But you know what, boys? You actually have a ring on your finger because of it, and you might get a couple of more. So stop whinging, boys, and just play. Your thoughts on that, JC?
Well said, Noz. Mate, that was a great insight into the Broncos stories since they joined the comp. Just on Madge, I believe he's exactly what they needed in 2025.
Yes.
His coaching record speaks for itself. And it's clear, as you said, he sets extremely high standards, demands the work, trains them to death, and, mate, isn't afraid to make the tough calls. Mate, just have a look at last Friday night, moving the current test centre, Shibasaki, to the bench. Mate, what a masterstroke. So I actually like the Broncos in this Madge era.
Okay. Now, mate, on to the upcoming round. So let's go into our round preview. We're going to start with the Seagulls versus the Roosters. Give us your thoughts.
All right. Well, let's firstly hope the Roosters turn up with some fight, especially with DCE heading back to Brookie to face his old club. Watching the Roosters right now, I'll be honest, it's like being on a roller coaster. Big high the previous week against South, then a massive drop against Penrith. If they lose to Manly, the spotlight's only going to get hotter for Sammy and DCE. Manly, on the other hand, mate, they haven't exactly set the world on fire to start the year. Seabulb's under real pressure. I think we said that the week before. So really, for me, whoever wins this one basically gets a chance to breathe a sigh of relief for another week. And I'm hoping it's my Roosters.
Right, the natural temptation here, considering the company and their usual high profile, is to discuss the Roosters, but I am shelving them for this week. I am not going to talk about anything red, white and blue. I'm going to give them all the attention they deserve for their current 15th place on the table, and that is none. Now, I have the same issue, unfortunately, with the Seagulls. So the Seagulls are a very talented team, currently going nowhere. So, but I hope both of these teams play like teams whose seasons are on the line. I'm going for the Seagulls, but that's only based on their Brookvale history. I've got no confidence whatsoever about this, mate.
Okay. Hope you're wrong there, mate. Let's move to the Warriors versus the Tigers. Mate, the Warriors are chasing 4 from 4. And at home, you'd back them to get it done. They've been super impressive to start the season, led by their forward pack and Tanner Boyd's running game. The Tigers, look, though they picked up some key injuries last week, and if Dewey and Luai don't play, the task only gets even tougher. This one could really get away from them, so I'm predicting a big scoreline for the Warriors in this one.
Now, mate, I'm looking at my notes for this and I've left it blank. I think I forgot about it, but maybe I just didn't want to contemplate the Warriors versus the Tigers for my tipping. Both of these teams are models of inconsistency. The Warriors have started the season off really strongly. The Tigers, they had a false dawn against the Cowboys a couple of weeks ago. I think the Warriors would be way too strong. That lack of structure that the Tigers had week in, week out, I think it's really going to cost them in this game, particularly against those really big, strong Warriors forwards.
Yeah, I agree. Let's move to the Broncos versus the Dolphins. I'm calling this battle of our house. Both teams are coming off strong wins. The Broncos had their backs to the wall with that comeback against Melbourne. And the Finns, well, Mate, they just turned it on against the Sharks. We've been saying this for the last few weeks. They can pretty much score from anywhere, especially the hammer. The guy's an absolute freak. I'm expecting a high scoring clash, but I'm tipping the Broncos to come out on top in this one.
The real opponent for the Broncos this week is the enemy within. The real challenge for them is to keep their defensive resolve, not let the Finns sucker them into a basketball game. If that happens, Redcliffe are in with a sniff, but I am leading towards the Bronx. Last week looked like a corner being turned for me.
And I love how you call the Finns Redcliffe. That's brilliant. Let's move to Bulldogs versus the Knights. Bulldogs back at home, first time this season. Look, I said it earlier. They showed real discipline against the Raiders and defended exceptionally well. Their attack, we keep saying it's still a work in progress with Galvin and Burton, but they should handle Newcastle quite comfortably. Personally, I would also give Stephen Crichton more early ball, and they could really pile on a number of tries if they do so.
The Bulldogs team continues to impress me. That might be because of the fact that I like defensive football. Now, they do have some things to work out in attack. You mentioned the fact that Connor Tracy was the best player on the field in their game against the Raiders last week. I also think that he might be part of the problem they have with their attacking clunkiness, but again, that'll be revealed later in the season. Again, defence wins games, mate. The Knights, well, their depleted team ran into a Warriors buzzsaw last week. While the Dogs don't have the attacking sparkle of the New Zealand team, I think their defence will get them home in this game.
Yeah, great. Panthers versus the Eels against your team, mate. Look, Para's record against Penrith in recent years hasn't been too bad. But look, to be honest, the way that Penrith have started season 26, clinical, pretty much suffocating opposition teams, it's going to be a massive task for Para. Penrith are firing across the park, not just their big guns. I think they're going to win quite comfortably, Noz.
I feel a little bit like the crew member on the Tantive 4 waiting for Darth Vader in the Imperial Stormtroopers just to come through the hole that's been blasted in their ship. Mate, Penrith truly are the men in black. They've been outstanding, absolutely outstanding for the first 3 weeks. And, mate, their two strengths, their middle roll, their attacking potency across the three-quarter line, mate, they inconveniently coincide with Parramatta's weaknesses. So Parramatta's defence across those two areas has been really suspect over the first 3 rounds. Now, that's only going to be made worse. News came through yesterday that Jermaine Hopgood has been ruled out for the season with an ACL injury. That doesn't do us any favours at all. Mate, with this one, I fear the Eels are going to be on roller skates going backwards. I've got my fingers crossed that local derby rules will hopefully apply. Parramatta will get stuck in and it'll be a little bit tighter than we expect. But a little bit like you, mate, I think the Panthers will actually put a score on the Eels.
Yeah. Let's move to Cowboys versus a Storm. Look, even in the Townsville humidity, it's never easy taking on a Melbourne team after a loss, especially a Craig Bellamy coach side. Melbourne switched off in the second half against the Broncos, but I can't see that happening against the Cows this weekend. Melbourne should win this one quite easily.
Yeah, mate, I think it's a case of watch out Cowboys. They were better last week. You mentioned the fact that they're going to have an advantage because they are playing at home, but this is a Storm side that will have had Craig Bellamy absolutely right in them all week. Now, about the Storm, there's certain things about the Storm that aren't particularly Storm-like. Utu Ikamanu is no Jesse Bromwich. I'm not even sure he's Kenny. And, mate, the reality of last week's game is they look like bystanders in the second half. Now, of course, you have to factor in that it is Melbourne. A down Storm team is still one that makes grand finals. And if we're calling a spade, this Cowboy team is no real match. So the Storm, and I think it's going to be a bounce back game.
Let's move to Raiders versus the Sharks. I'm actually looking forward to this one. You can bet Ricky will be reminding his troops it was actually the Sharks who surprisingly knocked out the Raiders from the finals last year, if you remember. And that was also played down in Canberra. So there's some great matchups in this game, especially in the halves and the forwards. The Raiders are still finding their groove. We all know they can attack like no other, but their poor discipline has let them down this season in a few games, like we saw against the Dogs. But I still reckon the Raiders can get the job done in this one.
Yeah, and I think you're right with this one. This would be a good test for the Raiders. They have been the epitome of inconsistency over the first couple of rounds. And funnily enough, that was one of their strengths last year. They were really consistent week in, week out, which is why they ended up winning the minor premiership. In last week's game against the Bulldogs, there were some concerning signs. Tarpany, Young, Papali'i, mate, they spent the entire game not only losing the ball, but also losing the plot. Their discipline was terrible, and it really cost them. If they do that this week, I think the Sharks will get them. I am looking forward to the clash between Tarpany and Fanua Blake. But here's a note to Joe, mate, stop bitching every time you get tackled. It's not only a really bad look, but it seems to flow into his play. When he's complaining against the referee and the decisions, it just seems though he's completely losing focus. Now, I think the Raiders will win this one. I think it'll be close, and I think they need to keep their heads. Now, onto the game of the round, Johnny. There was plenty to choose from. We've zagged a little bit with this one, though. There's only one game which has huge stakes this week, and that's the potential spoon preview of the Titans and the Dragons. So, mate, give us your take on this one.
No, is this a piss take, mate?
It is just this.
Okay. I'm predicting the Titans to win on the Goldie. Am I confident? No. But here's my big tip. At least one of these teams will get their first win of the season. So there you go. That's my hot take for game of the round.
And characteristically brief. But as I said, mate, there's no other game which has been played in round 4 which has stakes that are so high. Now, this may well be a case of the resistible force versus the movable object, but this game's also an interesting study in contrast. Maybe I'm doing a little bit of over-analysis here. The Dragons have a degree of resilience when they aren't dropping the ball every third tackle, and the Titans, particularly with Jaden Campbell and AJ Brimson, they do have some undoubted attacking flair. Again, I can't think of any other game over the weekend where both sides will be life and death fired up. I'm going for a smoky in this one with the Titans, but again, that probably just reflects my quirky/bad tipping. So we'll see how that one pans out after the round. Okay, Johnny, it is time for free balling. That's our part of the show where anything goes. Mate, this week you have an absolute ripper. So the floor is yours, mate. Let's go.
All right, Noz. All right, listeners. So, you know, I'm a bit of a NRL historian who loves a good flashback to yesteryear. So today I'm taking us down memory lane, reflecting on the great jersey sponsors of NRL teams over the years. And at the end, I'm actually also going to share my top 5 jersey sponsors of all time. But first, quick bit of trivia. Did you know that a young Nick Politis was actually the first to bring jersey sponsorship into the game back in 1976 with City Ford? What a pioneering moment that was when you think about NRL clubs and sponsors today. Okay, so let's deep dive into some of the classics over the years and in no particular order. I'll start with your team. Remember Eels with James Hardy, the Balmain Tigers with Phillips, South Sydney with 100 Pipers, which I think was a whiskey, and then the famous Smith's Crisps. Wests and Victor was a little favourite of mine. Norse had an original one, Norse Leagues, unbelievable. The Bulldogs in the early 80s had electronic sales and rentals. Later on, HFC Financial, and then Hyundai. The Warriors and Vodafone always had a nice ring to it. Roosters with City Ford obviously always had a great ring, and then more recently, Steggles. The Steelers had BHP, obviously supporting the Wollongong region. Dragons, no surprise, were with St George Bank. Knights and Henny Penny. Mate, you got to remind me what Henny Penny was. Manly had, I think it's pronounced Warmold and Pepsi. Penrith, the famous Da uniforms, and more recently Oak. Raiders, Woodgers, and then the iconic Canberra Milk. And then the big Bronx had Powers Brewing, the defunct Ansett. And obviously today we're seeing them with Kia. So there's a bit of a blast from the past. Looking at that list, there's probably a few brands that are no longer with us today. And as I was sort of alluding to earlier, there's probably some brands, I'll be honest, I had no idea what they even did. But I would say getting on an NRL jersey would have given these brands some pretty good flex. Okay, so based on that list, my all-time top 5 jersey sponsors are, number 1, I can't go past Phillips and the Balmain Tigers. I've got a soft spot for City, Ford and the Roosters. Obviously, they're the originals. James Hardy and the Eels are obviously synonymous with the Eels' success in the early 80s. I do love, number 4, I do love the Broncos and Kia. I just think it looks really slick, especially when they wear their black jerseys. And rounding out my number 5, I've always loved Canberra Milk with the Canberra Raiders. And then I've got a little special mention, a little soft spot for Wests and Victor. And I always loved the Bulldogs and HFC Financial. Okay, so that's my list. No doubt I've probably missed a few, so apologies there. And I've got to ask you, Noz, any favourites standouts from you, mate?
Kaiser Stool, the original jersey sponsor for the Illawarra Steelers. Mate, at this point, I feel a little bit like the Steve Buscemi mastermind evil alien in the Telstra ad. I don't even know what that means, but I just love the way that it rolls off the tongue. And, mate, a quick caveat to the Eels. I don't want to take this into dark places. There is the issue with the James Hardy connection. It will always epitomise the Parramatta glory years. When you see James Hardy across the front of their jerseys, you can't help but think of Ray Price, Mick Cronin, Peter Sterling. But, mate, the old trade unionist in me can't reconcile James Hardy's absolute scumbaggery in the early 2000s when it came to compensating the victims of their asbestos operations. It was only through the persistence and bravery of people like Bernie Banton that they were held to any sort of account and the workers got their due. I think we need to bear in mind that there are lots of benefits to the NRL becoming corporate, but at its very core, rugby league is the working man's game. So we gave a valet to Chuck Norris at the start of the episode. Let's shout out Bernie Banton, another great man.
Well said,
All right,
Noz.
Johnny. All right. The long blink is over, mate. And that wraps up another episode of NRL Offside. Mate, before we go, I would encourage all of our listeners to press the subscribe button, either on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Music. That will just ensure we hit your feed every week. Happy football watching, everyone. There's another slate of really good games coming up this weekend. But over to you, Johnny, to round us out.
Thanks, Noz, and thanks everyone for tuning in for episode 4. Enjoy your footy this weekend, and hopefully your team gets the chocolates. We'll catch you next week.